Hello again, and welcome to Deviant History. Our history begins on July 23rd, 1892, in the middle of nowhere in Ajersagoro, Ethiopia. The family of the local governor met his newborn son and named the boy Lij Teferi Makonnen, which is literally translated as respected child of Makonnen. His father, Ras Makonnen, was a cousin of the ruling Ethiopian emperor Menelik II. The Ethiopian dynasty had a great family legend claiming its descent from King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. The life of this boy was going to be a wealthy one. He would inherit his father's position as governor in the Harar province of eastern Ethiopia. But nothing saw a clear path to see a future as an emperor. As a child, Teferi lived through the First Italo-Ethiopian War. Italy already controlled Eritrea and planned to expand its African colonies by conquering Ethiopia, which looked like an easy conquest. But the surprisingly feudal and awkward Ethiopian army defeated Italian troops at the Battle of Adwa. Teferi's father did his best to achieve the victory, and he succeeded. This was the first time when an African country successfully defended its independence against a European colonial army. Emperor Menelik saw the advantage of a modern army and began buying weapons from Russia, Britain, and even Japan. In 1905, Teferi obtained the higher noble rank of Dejazmark. Actually, it had no connection to his personal achievement, but was given to him because he had reached the age of maturity. In 1906, his father suddenly died, and the 14-year-old teenager was appointed as acting governor of an insignificant province called Salalee, where he did nothing notable. Still, Teferi's noble life was very predictable. Meanwhile, the court in the capital, Addis Ababa, was wondering about a possible heir for the old and now ill emperor. As many other Ethiopian aristocrats, Menelik was married and divorced several times. The local Orthodox Church was pretty tolerant to the practice, but the problem was in recognizing all of the children. The number of Menelik's children is not precisely known. He had been married 3 times, but his only son and 2 daughters were the only ones recognized by him. At the age of 15, Menelik's son died of tuberculosis, and intrigues around the throne rose. The emperor himself survived a stroke, and there was not much time to make a decision. Menelik was the monarch who had centralized the Ethiopian empire, and it was going to fall into turmoil again if an heir would not be defined before the emperor's death. As for Teferi, he was not even regarded as a candidate and continued making predictable career for an Ethiopian nobleman of his rank. By the age of 18, he had been appointed the position of governor in the Harar province. Finally, Menelik II appointed his grandson, Iyasu, as his heir, and Menelik died soon after that. The new ruler and the court did not get along at all. The tension was obvious, and even the ceremony of coronation was delayed. Iyasu forever remained the emperor without a crown. The crucial factor in this was a rumor that the young emperor had the intention to convert to Islam. His father, Ras Michael of Wollo, was married to one of Menelek's daughters. But there was a much more important part of this story. Michael was born as Muhammad Ali, and in fact had been forced to convert to Christianity in his mature years. Because of this, nobles and the church were united against Emperor Ieyasu. And that was the moment when Teferi got into politics. He was supported by Habte Georgis Ninagde, the Minister of War under Menelik II. Although Teferi's exact role in the coup against Ieyasu was not very clear, it was obvious his father's reputation worked for him, as well as his provincial troops. This was especially true in the eyes of Habte Georgis Ninagde, who also fought against the Italian invasion. The coup itself was a unique case in Ethiopian history. Menelek's older daughter, Zuditu, was declared the new monarch, becoming the first woman in Ethiopia and the entire African continent who ruled on her own. Ieyasu escaped from the palace, but was not going to give up. Ras Michael rose to protect his son's throne. At the Battle of Sagali, Michael was defeated and captured by the united troops loyal to Teferi and the Empress. Teferi's loyalty to Menelek's court and to the new Empress was appreciated. He appeared at the right place at the right time and became regent, the second most powerful person in the imperial hierarchy after the Empress. The Empress had the right of last word, but all the administrative work and representative functions were transferred to Teferi, along with the title Ras. During this time, he also contracted the Spanish flu, but he survived. As Ras Teferi, he became known to the entire world in the 1920s when he visited Europe and lavished exotic gifts on the French and British governments. At the same time, his power began disturbing some of the nobles. Ras Teferi was challenged by a hero of the First Italo-Ethiopian War named Balcha Safo. Balcha Safo became the governor of Harar after the death of Teferi's father, but in several years he was replaced by Teferi himself, and that was the cause of a long-term conflict between these two men. On February 11, 1928, Balcha Safo appeared in the capital city, accompanied by his numerous troops. Teferi had to act creatively, and his people bribed Safo's commanders while the rebel nobleman was arrested at the palace and exiled to his manor. But that was not the end of the drama, for the Empress herself had become suspicious about her regent. She found support among some high-ranking nobles and from her husband, the prince consort Gugso Wele. A new attempted coup was discovered by Teferi. His guards blocked the rebels at Menelek's crypt, but at the same time his troops were blocked themselves by the guards of the Empress. But then more troops hurried to the area, and those were loyal to Teferi. The Empress was scared and stopped confronting Teferi to avoid bloodshed. To propitiate him, she gave him the title of Negus, which meant king. For a short while, Ethiopia had two monarchs. The prince consort was not pleased, but Negus Teferi was able to solve this problem. At the Battle of Anchem on March 31, 1930, Negus Teferi used aviation for the first time in Ethiopian history. 3 machines provided a psychological attack on the rebels by their appearance and the leaflets which they dropped, which included untrue information that the Empress condemned the prince consort's actions. There was also the promise to excommunicate everybody if they fought against the legal monarchs. A group of the rebels deserted without fighting. The other group was eliminated by Teferi's troops. And the prince consort, Gugsawele, was killed during the battle. Soon after that, the Empress Zuditu died in her palace in circumstances that are not completely clear, but now are believed to have been from complications of diabetes. Negus Teferi sat on the throne, and according to ancient Ethiopian tradition, he changed his name, choosing Haile Selassie, which meant power of the Trinity. Under the new emperor, Ethiopia became the last country in the world that officially abolished slavery. The external problems stayed the same. No direct access to seaports, a backward economy, backward army, and nobles who opposed the government course for modernization. Haile Selassie almost had to apologize, saying, "We would not need to have modern things if we were not surrounded by them." He, of course, meant the British, the French, and the Italian colonies, which were all around his country. The Italian fascist leader, Benito Mussolini, finally decided to try again and conquer Ethiopia. This time, the Italians in Eritrea prepared much better. The troops invaded Ethiopia on October 3, 1935, without an official declaration of war. When the superiority of the Italian army became obvious, the emperor made a short pilgrimage to the rock-hewn churches of Lalibela and was asked by his court to leave the country in order to save the dynasty. On May 4, 1936, he and his family came aboard the British cruiser Enterprise in French Somalia, and they headed for Palestine, which was controlled by the UK. Finally, they did settle in England, where Haile Selassie sold some of the family treasures to buy a manor house in the town of Bath. Their exile was much shorter than many of the European exiled governments who had settled in Britain within the Second World War, and in January 1941, Allies released Ethiopia. Haile Selassie was not only back, but was benefited by the war as Eritrea, with its ports and infrastructure, was transferred under his control. The emperor began building his new army enthusiastically, since the old one had been eliminated. That also meant there were fewer old aristocrats who would challenge his course. His implacable opponent, Balchasafo, as well as many other powerful aristocrats, had died with guns in arms fighting against Italians, and Haile Selassie did not have to worry about his absolute power for a while. After World War II, he made a bid on cooperation with the United States and sent young militaries to study abroad. In this case, he didn't differ very much from his contemporary royal colleagues, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, the Shah of Iran, and King Zahir Shah of Afghanistan. And, like them, he finally experienced the other side of education. Somehow it seemed to be more difficult to rule among better educated people. The traditional poverty of the general Ethiopian population made young intellectuals look for its cause and possible solutions. These thoughts caused reasonable questions about the government's efficiency. The protests were suppressed, as they used to be. But the world had changed. Information became available to people globally and turned into a powerful political tool. That was a new situation to the emperor, who approached his 80th birthday. He had survived another coup attempt. This attempt had been organized by officers planning to replace Haile Selassie by his son, Crown Prince Selassie. The coup was prevented this time, but the general situation in the country became worse. In addition to his damaged reputation, the Human Rights Watch accused Haile Selassie with acts of illegitimate violence towards the protesters. There were people who loved the emperor selflessly. It all began in the early 1920s, when an Afrocentric black political activist named Marcus Garvey from Jamaica gave his misty prophecy about a king who would rise to power in Africa and let all the people of African descent come back for a better life. And the man who was chosen for this, the man who fit this description, was none other than our Rastafari, or, as pronounced in English, Rastafari. This was the birth of the Rastafari movement far away from Africa, in Jamaica and the West Indies. Later it was promoted even more due to the popular reggae music and its icon, Bob Marley. They called the emperor by different names, including official ones, and Yah and Yahya, that marked God in the Jewish tradition. This dynasty legend about King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba played very well. Haile Selassie was one of the few politicians who became superstars of this kind. The emperor even granted land in Ethiopia to Rastafari followers, but did nothing more for the movement. Being interviewed, he denied his divine origin, in which Rastafari followers still believe. Rastafarian temples appeared around the world, and preachers were convinced that Haile Selassie was the incarnation of God, and therefore immortal. Meanwhile, Ethiopia had another coup attempt on September 12, 1974. It was provoked by continuing protests, a poorly paid military, and a severe famine. The country stayed rural, and any natural disorder was able to affect the entire population. 82-year-old Haile Selassie was placed under house arrest by Ethiopian officers who followed communist ideas. The ex-emperor spent almost 1 year under arrest, still claiming he was the legitimate ruler. On August 28, 1975, the National Radio of Ethiopia broadcast that the former emperor had died of respiratory failure. That was only partially true, since Haile Selassie had actually been strangled in his bed. After the communist regime collapsed in 1991, some of the coup participants were interrogated. They showed a place next to the palace where Haile Selassie was buried. Since the exhumation was not filmed, it caused rumors that perhaps Haile Selassie had not actually died, and his body had not been thrown into a cesspit. The Ethiopian Church did not recognize the remains as the ones belonging to Haile Selassie. The new government did, but refused to organize the funeral ceremony in accordance with royal traditions. Bob Marley's widow presided at a humble funeral. The remains were brought to the Holy Trinity Cathedral of Addis Ababa in the year 2000, 8 years after their discovery. The story seems now to be ended for Haile Selassie, but not for Rastafari. Rastafarianism lives on. Thank you for joining us tonight, and we'll see you next week. Please like us and subscribe.
Ooh.